It's 1945, the final days of Nazi Germany, and somewhere in the war-torn countryside, a 16-year-old boy crouches in a ditch. His heart is pounding so hard, it feels like it might burst out of his chest. But he's not hiding from bullies, or even an angry parent. No, this teenager is a spy, and right now, American soldiers are closing in on him. Fast. His name was Heinz Petrie, and he wasn't just any spy. He was one of the youngest spies in World War II. But here's where it gets darker. Just a few months later, Heinz is no longer crouching in a ditch. He's standing tall, staring down the barrels of a firing squad. And in moments, his short, tragic life would come to an end. So how did this 16-year-old kid get himself into this? And how did an organization that once organized camping trips turn into sending kids to die on the front lines? Picture a world where children swap toys for weapons. During World War II, millions of kids were sucked into one of the most disturbing youth organizations in history, the Hitler Youth. Now you might think, okay, it was like a Boy Scouts thing, right? Wrong. The Hitler Youth wasn't just some after-school club. It was an indoctrination machine, cranking out an entire generation of kids molded into the perfect Nazi citizens. By 1939, it was mandatory for all Aryan kids aged 10 to 18, and by its peak, it had over 8 million members. That's nearly every eligible child in Nazi Germany. But here's where it gets chilling. The Nazis used psychological tactics that were terrifyingly effective. They tapped into something natural, the human need to belong. They created a sense of community, purpose, and adventure that was irresistible to young minds. Hiking, camping, sports, it all looked so innocent, but every activity was preparing these kids for something far darker: war. And the most sinister part? The effects of this indoctrination didn't stop when the war ended. These kids grew up with loyalty to Nazi ideology that ran so deep that many struggled with critical thinking or independent thought, even after the Reich had crumbled. It messed them up for life. As the war escalated, so did the Hitler Youth's role. By 1943, it was no longer about summer camps and sports. Boys as young as 14 were being trained to fight, combat techniques, handling weapons, even driving tanks. The line between childhood and warfare was gone. But it didn't stop there. In 1943, the Hitler Youth officially became part of the German army. These were no longer just kids, they were child soldiers, thrown into combat alongside grown men, tasked with defending their country against the advancing Allied forces. The organization that once organized camping trips was now sending kids to die on the front lines. But for some members, even that wasn't enough. No. A select few were chosen for something even darker, something more dangerous. What? Let's get into that. As Allied forces closed in on Nazi Germany, the regime made a chilling decision. Picture this: a 12-year-old boy, barely tall enough to see over the controls of a tank, now tasked with defending Berlin from the most powerful armies in the world. Just think about that for a second. Did you? Some of them were assigned to anti-tank units armed with Panzerfausts, rocket launchers nearly as big as the kids themselves. It was a heartbreaking, terrifying sight, boys wielding weapons almost as tall as they were, fighting battles they never stood a chance of winning. But here's where it gets even worse: the training these kids received. It was barely anything. They were given crash courses in handling weapons, and maybe a little bit of tactical instruction. Some of them got only a few hours of training, before being sent straight to the front lines. These kids, some just 12 or 13 years old, were expected to hold their ground against seasoned Allied troops, armed with superior numbers and better equipment. The result? Predictable and tragic. The casualty rates among these teenage soldiers were staggering. Thousands of young lives were lost in the final brutal weeks of the war, and many didn't just die from enemy fire. No. Some of these kids died from accidents, blown up by their own weapons because they simply didn't know how to use them properly. But it didn't stop there. As the situation became even more desperate, the demands on these child soldiers became more horrifying. In Berlin, some Hitler Youth members as young as 14 were given a new job: hunting down and executing deserters. That's right, kids were turned into executioners, carrying out the twisted will of the Nazi regime. If you find this intriguing, subscribe and hit that like button to hear more real-life stories like this one. Moving on. For some, even that wasn't enough. A select few were chosen for something darker, espionage. And that's where we meet Heinz Petry and Josef Schoner. These two teenagers were thrust into the world of espionage. Their mission? Infiltrate American lines, gather intelligence, and report back. Simple, right? But their training? Almost non-existent. They were given crash courses in espionage and sabotage. They barely learned how to use a pistol before being sent out. Petry and Schoner were part of the Werwolf organization, Heinrich Himmler's last-ditch plan to create a resistance movement behind enemy lines. Sabotage, guerrilla warfare, assassinations, that was the plan. These kids were supposed to be the secret weapons, slipping past enemy defenses unnoticed. But as the boys ventured deeper into American-held territory, reality set in. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every friendly face could be a spy. The weight of their mission pressed down on them. They were teenagers, way in over their heads. And then, it happened. The moment they feared most. American forces tipped off about spies in the area and closed in on Petry and Schoner. Their lack of experience, their rushed training, it all caught up with them. In a heart-pounding confrontation, they were surrounded. Their brief, terrifying careers as spies were over. And it didn't end the way they imagined. The capture of Heinz Petry and Josef Schoner marked the start of a moral dilemma that would haunt the American military for years. Were these boys dangerous Nazi spies deserving of punishment? Or were they just misguided kids caught in a war they couldn't understand? On March 29, 1945, a military tribunal convened to decide their fate. Picture this: two terrified teenagers, still wearing their Hitler Youth uniforms, standing before a panel of stone-faced American officers. The charges? Espionage and sabotage, both carrying the death penalty. The courtroom became a battlefield. Should these boys be treated as prisoners of war, protected under the Geneva Conventions? Or were they spies, subject to military justice? The prosecution argued that their actions posed a serious threat to Allied forces, regardless of their age. The defense? They pleaded for mercy, pointing to their youth and the brainwashing they had endured. The tribunal wrestled with one fundamental question: at what point does a child become responsible for their actions in wartime? Some officers argued for leniency, others demanded swift, severe justice, believing that making an example of these boys would deter future espionage. As the tribunal neared its decision, the tension was suffocating. Petry and Schoner, who had maintained a tough front, now looked exactly like what they were: scared kids. The weight of their actions and the consequences was finally sinking in. And then, the verdict. By a 2/3 majority, the tribunal sentenced both Heinz Petry and Josef Schoner to death. The shock in the room was immediate. Even the hardened soldiers couldn't reconcile the image of these young boys with the fate that now awaited them. As the sun rose on June 1, 1945, two young lives came to a tragic and abrupt end. Heinz Petry and Josef Schoner, barely more than boys, were executed, casualties of a system that turned children into weapons of war. Today, organizations like UNICEF fight around the clock to protect children from being exploited in conflicts all over the world. But as long as wars rage on, the threat remains. And that raises the critical question: how do we shield the next generation from becoming pawns in these brutal games of power and destruction? Petry and Schoner's fate serves as a haunting reminder of war's terrifying ability to rob children of their innocence. If history has taught us anything, it's that war doesn't just destroy cities and nations, it can destroy childhood itself. Thanks for watching. If you found this video intriguing, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and stay tuned for more episodes of Dark and Strange. Until next time.